In this video, we're going to talk about expressions, and in particular, we're going to talk about a special kind of expression called a literal expression. We're also going to talk about strings. So let's take a look at the program that we had going last time. I've made some small modifications to it. We've got this variable number of bananas. We've got a variable number of apples. Now here's something we did not do last time. Right? I said that, that a variable was something that contained a value. So here we have number of bananas is equal to number of apples. Right? So number of bananas starts off as 1. Number of apples starts off as 2. Number of bananas is then assigned the value of number of apples. Number of apples is then changed to 3. So the question is, what's the value of number of bananas now? Right? Is it 3 because number of bananas is number of apples and number of apples is now 3? Or is it 2? Well, let's answer this question through science. We can actually debug it and find out. Right? So we'll step into it. And we can see in our locals window, right, that they begin both as 0. Right? And then number of bananas becomes 1. Number of apples becomes 2. Number of bananas becomes number of apples. Well, number of apples is 2, so number of bananas is now 2. Right? Remember, this highlight here is what is going to happen next, not what just happened. Right? So number of apples is still 3, or still 2. It's about to become 3. Now it's become 3. Number of bananas did not change. It stayed as 2. Right? So why is that? Well, there are programming languages in which you can say this variable is an alias, right? Is another name for this other variable, right? And C# is not one of them. At least none of the C# features that we're going to look at in this course are like that. There are some ways in which you can alias one variable to another. There's a couple different ways to do that in C#. We're not going to look at any of them. In this case, number of bananas simply takes on the value that is stored in number of apples. Right? You can think about it as 2 boxes. Right? You know, one of the boxes is named number of bananas. One of the boxes is named number of apples. Right? And we are simply saying, OK, if the number 2 is in this box, make a copy of it in this box. The boxes are independent. Right? So let's look at some other things that we can do with this. We saw last time that you could say console.writeLine number of bananas plus number of apples. Right? And as expected, this print out the sum of the values of the 2 variables. So this is called an expression, right? And what is an expression? I've used that term a couple of times. There is a very technical definition of expression that I'm not going to go into. For our purposes, an expression is a fragment of the program that has a value associated with it. Right? The formal definition of what makes an expression in C# is super complicated, and it is really only of interest to people like me who are actually designing languages or designing compilers or analyzers for the language. Right? For our purposes, expressions are just something that has a value. Right? So let's take a look at the different kinds of things that have values in this program. Right? To begin with, we have this expression right here. Right? We have the expression, which is the literal integer 1. Right? And by a literal expression, I mean an expression whose value actually appears in the source code itself. Right? So integer literals, as you would expect, are 1 and 2 and -6 and 0 and those kinds of things. Sometimes they're just called literals instead of literal expressions, but we always mean this is an expression whose value appears right in the code. Now, in our first program, we had console.writeLine hello world. Right? That is also a literal value. Right? This is called a string literal. A string literal is a textual literal. Now you might ask, why is it called a string? It turns out that in programming languages, textual values are traditionally called strings. I'm not exactly sure why. That's kind of been lost to the mists of history, but it makes a little bit of sense, right? You think about a bunch of characters that are sort of strung one after the other, and it's a string. And so just as with integer literals are integer values that appear directly in the program, string literals are textual values that appear directly in the program. And we'll see that in C# there's a bunch of different ways to make string literals, but the most common way is to simply surround a bunch of text in quotation marks. All right, so those are two kinds of expressions that we've seen in this program, both literals. Here we have an assignment from number of apples to the variable number of bananas. Both of these are expressions. So the name of a variable is an expression because both of these things have values. There's a rule in C# that says that the thing that is on the left-hand side of an assignment has to be something whose value can change, right? So we couldn't say 3 equals number of apples. But we could say number of apples is equal to 3. We did that right here. Right? So this is also a kind of expression. And then there are complicated expressions that are formed up of several expressions. Right? So the number of bananas plus number of apples is an arithmetic expression. Specifically, it's an addition expression. The plus symbol is called the addition operator. And there's a bunch of different operators in C#. We'll talk about those in a later video. And the two expressions that it adds together are called the operands. And so you can see here in this expression, we have two operands, number of bananas, number of apples. Each one of them is itself an expression. Right? And we can see that we can add together pretty much any two expressions. So we could say console.writeLine. We could say 1, 2, 3 plus 4, 5, 6. All right, so we've got two expressions. They're both literals, right? And we can add them together. Right? We could say console.writeLine 1, 2, 3 plus number of apples. Right? So again, we have two expressions. One is an integer literal. The other is a variable. We can add them together. Right? We can even get more complicated than that. Right? We could say console.writeLine 1, 2, 3 plus 4, 5, 6 plus number of apples. Right? Well, how does this work? Well, what we've got here is we've got an expression, right? 1, 2, 3 plus 4, 5, 6. And we've added that this is itself an expression. Right? And then to that expression, we have added another expression. Right? And in a later video, we'll be talking about exactly how it is that the C# compiler breaks down these complicated expressions to try to understand them. Now, here's an interesting question. What if I start throwing string literals into the mix? What if I say console.writeLine ABC plus DEF? Not sure what that would even mean. So what's going to happen here? Well, let's find out. I'm just going to hit F5. Take a look at the console window. And it's written out A, B, C, D, E, F. Right? So it turns out that the addition operator, when it is given strings, becomes the concatenation operator. It takes these two strings and glues them together. Right? So you then might ask, well, what happens if we do something even more weird, like we say console.writeLine 1, 2, 3 plus 4. Right? Now what's going to happen? It seems like there are two possibilities here. We could say, well, the string contains a number, so we should convert it to the number 4 and then add it to the integer value 123. Or you could say, well, we're trying to do an addition with a string, right? So we should probably treat both of these things as strings and concatenate them together. Or a third possibility is we could throw up our hands and produce an error. Well, there's no red squiggly under this thing, so apparently C# has not decided to throw up its hands and produce an error here. It's decided that what you want is, let's find out, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it has converted both operands to strings, concatenated them together. Summing up this video, we've seen that expressions are, loosely speaking, things that have values. That we call bits of text strings for no apparently good reason. that literal expressions are expressions whose values appear directly in the code. We've seen integer literals and we've seen string literals. We've seen that an addition expression takes two operands and produces the value of their sum. And we've seen that the addition operator, when given strings, suddenly becomes the concatenation operator, not the numeric addition operator. In the next video, we're going to take a look at statements.